I want to kick off today's message, and I want to have a little bit of fun together, okay? We're going to do that a couple times throughout this message, and we're going to kick off with a question. Here's the condition of this question. You have to be truthful. If you're willing to be truthful, say yes. Okay, you know who you are who just said that. In this, you got to be truthful. Here's the deal. You can't be humble when I ask this question. Okay? So you can set humility aside for a few moments. You're going to be truthful, again, for fun here. Here we go. How many of you would say that you are probably smarter than the average person? Raise your hand. Okay. Some of you, I asked you to not be humble, and some of you went with it. Now, the others of you who didn't raise your hand, you may say, I'm not answering that question because I'm in church. But most of you think it. Most of you think you're a better driver than the majority of people. Most of you probably think you're less sinful than the average person. When it comes to various topics or issues, most of you think you are more right than most people. I know for me, I'm way above average. And actually, I'm not bragging. It's just that we live in this world where there's so many important people, but so many important issues, but so many dumb people. Exactly. You know what I'm talking about. Come on, let's just be honest for a minute. So if you want to know what to believe about something, I'm happy to tell you because I believe that I'm right. Again, we're having a little fun here together with this, and there's certainly some sarcasm in it, but I want you to work with me here on this. So if you want to know about theology, I can tell you the truth. I tell you the truth about end times, about spiritual gifts, about women in ministry. And anybody who disagrees with me, I'll show you why you're wrong. I can show you the right approach to that vaccine, to capitalism, to bearing arms, to abortion, to sexual and gender issues, to capital punishment, and on and on. I can show you the right way. All right, sarcasm over. But seriously, most of us sort of feel that way, don't we? If we're, you don't have to answer that out loud, but maybe a head shake or two. Most of us sort of feel that way. So what I want to do today is I want to push you a little bit. In fact, I would say this, if I'm not pushing you and if you're not getting mad a few times a year, I'm probably not doing my job, right? So today I want to push you a little bit. And so if you're okay with that, I want you to say out loud, push me. Okay, just remember, you said it. So, what I want you to do is turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. I'm going to give you some context here as we go to Luke 18. Jesus, he was surrounded by people in his culture that were not unlike people in our culture today. He was surrounded by people who always felt that they were right. In fact, their goal in life really was to be always right. We know the right way. We have the right way. We behave the right way. We live the right way. We do the right thing, which means everybody else is wrong. They thought they were smarter than everybody else. They thought they were better than everybody else. They thought they were holier than everybody else. And so in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, Jesus is going to tell a parable to these specific types of people. And I want you to notice who they are, or who they were. Luke chapter 18, verse 9, it says this, to some who were confident in their what? In their own righteousness, and what did they do? They looked down on everybody else. So to those people, confident they're right, and who find themselves looking down on other people, Jesus told this parable, verse 10. Here's the parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, if you don't know much about a Pharisee was outwardly righteous. Okay, outwardly speaking, they would dress the part. They would actually pray loud prayers in front of everybody, make them sound so close to God. They followed the 613 laws and commands that God had given. The tax collector, on the other hand, was outwardly despised because of his outward sinfulness. And so you have this guy, this outward tax collector, this traitor to his people, so to speak, and he's outwardly sinful, and you have this other guy who's outwardly righteous, who's visibly right. Verse 11, Luke chapter 18. The Pharisee stood by himself, and here's what he prayed to God in front of everybody. God, I thank you that I am not like other people. To use our message from last week, I thank you that I'm not like, did anybody remember? Those people. What group is he referring to? Because we all have our other people, those people. I thank you that I'm not like the robbers and the evildoers and the adulterers, or even like this tax collector right here. And then he gives his spiritual resume. Hey, I thank you, God, that I'm not like them. Here's my bona fides. Verse 12, I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector, what did he do? He stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast. It was a form of humility. And he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, I want you to notice what Jesus then says in this parable, in this story. Jesus says, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, the visibly outwardly sinful person, this man, the tax collector, rather than the visibly righteous-looking guy, the tax collector went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What's so interesting to me is that the Pharisee here, he sees himself right and that other guy as wrong. He was right. The tax collector was wrong. But to Jesus, it wasn't just about right and wrong. To Jesus, it was also about pride and humility. Why? Because proud people just don't love well. Let me say it again. Proud people just don't love well. And so I thought about the different titles for today's message, and what I came up with today is, what makes you think you're so right? What makes you think you're so right? Today, not unlike a couple thousand years ago, there's so much tension in our culture and society. Would you agree with that? So much tension. Why? Well, part of it, I believe, is because so many people are convinced they are right, and yet there's just as many people equally on the other side of their rightness. And unfortunately, Christians, if we're not careful, it's easy for you and I to slip into our own rightness, into our own spiritual pride, into being like this Pharisee, being like the person who looks down on others. When you and I live our lives focused on our goodness, our rightness, our righteousness, we get easily offended by those who we don't think are right. So we're offended by what somebody posts, or what somebody how they vote, how somebody believes, how they behave. We spend so much of our time in life being offended. Here's the problem for you and I when we spend our life and time being offended. The longer we live offended, the more that offense settles in our hearts. And when something begins to settle in your heart or my heart, what starts happening? It starts to bake, right? It starts to simmer. It starts to grow. And man, when that offense grows, it grows from being offended or an offense. It grows to flat out contempt. And we find ourselves, instead of, hating what somebody does, the whole hate the sin, we end up hating who somebody is. Now, we're here in church, so we're going to say, I never hate anybody. Use whatever word you want. Look down on people, whatever it may be, elevate yourself, whatever it is. But that offense grows into contempt, and we look down on others. We hate others. But Pastor, we're Christians. And so we have the truth, and we're right, and we're guardians of the truth. I mean, Pastor, truth matters. Yes, of course it matters. But if we're not careful, since we perceive ourselves as guardians of the truth, and I'm not sure the Bible makes a case for that, but if we perceive ourselves as guardians of the truth, we start to think it's our job to, quote, assess people. Everybody say assess. Not judge them, because I shouldn't judge. I don't judge. I assess people. And I have the authority to assess people because I'm on the side of truth. And so I can look down upon people from the parable, if you will. That guy's okay, but him, not so much, what he does. She's, no problem, but man, do you see the way she raises her kids? Can you see the way how we assess people? Give you a little church example. We might think we're right about theology. We're right about churches. And so we can assess other churches. And maybe it's not us, but the people can be like this. We're the right one, and other people are the wrong one. Oh, that church, they're way too shallow. Man, we teach the unadulterated Word of God, and we do exegetical verse by verse, just like Jesus never taught. So like the Pharisee, because we're right and our way is right, everybody else who isn't lined up with us is wrong. Everybody who doesn't do it our right way is wrong. But here's the truth. Every single one of us is messed up. Every one of us. And so, if you actually want to quote the Bible, could I just encourage you to quote to yourself also Jeremiah 17, verse 9, which says, the human heart is the most what? Deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. I love that there's an asterisk next to it that has your name there. Except you. I love it. You're off the hook. All of us, our hearts are wicked and deceitful. You see, as much as you think you might think you're right, the reality is we are often far more wrong than we realize. In fact, we're often very wrong. And even if we are right, our approach that we reach out to people, our approach may be wrong, which discounts our rightness. For example, what if you are right? What if you're more right than most people, than everybody else, but you're not loving? Okay? What if you're right, but you're rude? What if you're right, but frankly, you're a jerk? What if you're right? What if you're right, but all you're doing is making a point, and you're not actually making a kingdom impact, or not actually making an eternal difference for the kingdom? Jesus wasn't just concerned about right and wrong. He was also concerned about pride and humility. Our tone matters. Our approach matters. Our attitude matters. Our presentation matters. I want to give you an example on this. And again, I'm going to enter into sarcasm mode for a moment that's laced with a little bit of truth, so kind of hang with me here. We're going to play a game together for the next minute or so. Okay? Here's the game. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, okay? And then I'm going to ask you if you like me. If you like me more. And if you want to follow Jesus more because of how amazing I am. Ready to play the game? All right. First of all, Heather and I, we dated. We didn't live together. We didn't have sex before marriage. We did it God's way. I basically eat pretty decent. I drink 1 to 2 gallons of water a day. I never have soda. I never have coffee. I never have alcohol. I've never done drugs. I exercise every single day since summer of 2020. I have literally, not figuratively, literally ran over 10,000 miles. I don't swear. I have no debt except my home. I've never paid interest on a credit card because if I use it for the points and I pay it off before the end of the month. I tithe 10%, actually more, to LifePoint. And then on top of the tithe, I sponsor kids and missionaries. Speaking of missionaries, I've been on over 30 mission trips. I've raised some pretty amazing kids. I read the Bible daily. I pray daily. So let me ask you, in light of all that, do you like me more? Yeah, okay, there we go. Everybody's afraid to say what they're thinking at first. That was the pause. Does all that make you want to follow Jesus more because of how good and holy I am? What's the answer? No, of course not. In fact, some of you now probably hate me a little more. What's the point? People are not drawn to Jesus because of our moral superiority and how good we are. They're not drawn to Jesus by how right we are. People are drawn to Jesus by how we show and demonstrate love to them. Just because you're right or holy doesn't mean you're making a difference. It doesn't mean you're making an impact and having influence for Jesus. The reality is, and you already knew it, I'm not even close to perfect, and neither are you. There's only one who's perfect, Hebrews 4:15. We have one who's been tempted in every way, just like us, and yet he did not sin. So we know Jesus. He's the only perfect person, the only sinless person. And what's so fascinating about Jesus is that even though he never sinned, he was perfect. His resume was amazing. And yet people were drawn to him. My resume I gave you, that's not bringing you to me, I can guarantee. But Jesus' resume was perfect. And people were drawn to him. They were drawn to him. For example, countless times Jesus would go to parties of sinners. And people flocked to him. They wanted to be in his company. They wanted to be in his presence. There was once this prostitute who was so moved by the love and grace and compassion of Jesus that she came and she worshiped him by coming and kneeling at his feet and taking her very, very, very expensive perfume, which is basically saying her savings, and pouring it out onto Jesus as an act of worship. There's this tax collector, a sinner, right? Somebody who's betrayed his own people to the Roman government. And what happened? Jesus said, I want to hang out with you. I want to have dinner at your house. And so he goes and has dinner with him and all his evil, sinful friends. Jesus was perfect without sin, and yet sinful people were drawn to him. Here's the question. Why? Why is it? Why do you think that sinful, broken, messed up people, why did they want to be around Jesus? And even a parenthetical there, and they don't want to really be around us. Why did they want to be around Jesus? Simple, because Jesus didn't make them feel wrong. He made them feel loved. In fact, I want us to look at what I believe is perhaps the most important passage in all the New Testament about how you and I should treat people. And it's found in John chapter 13. I want you to turn there now. It's a passage I talk about quite often. And so let's set up the context here. John chapter 13, verse 1, it says this. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. So you can imagine here, Jesus has been faithful to God in his purposes and in his mission. And so now Jesus is preparing here. We're right at the moment where he's getting ready to go to the cross and fulfill his mission. And notice what it says. Scripture says, having loved his own who were in the world, what did Jesus do? He loved them to the end. Well, how did he do it? Well, in this passage, he's sitting around a table or on the ground, and he's having a very intimate dinner with his closest disciples. This is the last meal they're going to have together before Jesus is betrayed, arrested, falsely tried, convicted, and going to the cross or being crucified. So they're in this moment, they're in this intimate meal, they've had this meal together, and then Jesus does something that's absolutely shocking, something that would have never been expected. He takes off his outer robes, and he puts on a slave's apron or a servant's robe. And then what does he do, if you know the story? He goes to each disciple, he kneels down in front of them, and he takes this towel, this wash basin, and he begins to wash their feet. God washing our feet. You know, any other religion that leads with that? God washes our feet. By the way, a servant, it was the one thing a servant wasn't required to do. It's one thing they could opt out of. And that's what Jesus does. And then he says this, because he does this in the most humble way possible. There's nothing more humble than washing someone's feet. So that's the context as we're about to read what he says next. John chapter 13, verse 33, he says, my children. He's talking to his disciples. He says, my children. The only time Jesus used the word. Every other time we're talking about Jesus, he's like their friend. He's the man, the Son of Man. But right now, he's God the Father in the presence of the Son. And suddenly he uses this term, my children. So his tone's different. And he says in verse 33, I will be with you only a little longer. You'll look for me, and just as I have told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. And then he says this, John 13, verse 34, a new commandment I give to you. Now the word for new means fresh. The word means not worn out. So here's our context. You guys tracking with me? Jesus said, I'm going to love you to the end. He just washed their feet. Judas has just slipped out of the room. He's going to betray Jesus. And Jesus says, love one another. New command I give you. This is new, coming from me. A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. For me, for Chris, personally, I think five of the most powerful words in all the Bible are those 5 words. As I have loved you. As I have loved you. Imagine if you reframe the entire Bible, the entire New Testament, everything that Paul ever said. Imagine if you framed it through the lens of Jesus saying, as I have loved you. In other words, the way I'm loving you right now, in this style, in this context, I'm washing your feet. I'm humiliating myself. Humilifying. That's what came to my mind. I'm humbling myself, doing what nobody is required to do, genuinely being a servant. As I have loved you, what did Jesus say? So you, us, must love one another. And then this is beautiful. He says, verse 35, by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. How will they know that we love Jesus? How will the world know that we're his followers? How will they know that we are followers of Jesus, that we love Jesus, that he is our Lord, that he is our Savior? They won't know we're his disciples by what we're against. They won't know we're his disciples by how we vote or what we post or how right we are on any particular topic or issue. They'll know that we belong to Jesus by the way that we love. As I have loved you, Jesus says, so you love one another. Meaning we put a towel on our arm. We get down on our knees and we humbly serve others. Humble. Without pride, as I have loved you. So then, why do we find ourselves not loving others in a manner that Jesus called us to love others? Part of the answer may be we're just too busy being right. We're too wrapped up in being right, being righteous, being like the Pharisee who prayed in Jesus' parable, because we're too wrapped up in looking down on others. Yes, 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 yes. Jesus was concerned about right and wrong. He was also concerned about pride and humility. Because when you and I start from a place of pride, in other words, when we start from a place of I'm right, that just starts a terrible pattern in our life, really a negative cycle that's going to take place in our life. If our posture is I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I have truth, the first thing we're going to start to feel is morally superior to others who aren't as right as us. Or we're going to feel morally superior to those other losers who are wrong. And when you and I feel morally superior, man, that's when it's easy for us to become judgmental of those who are not right, who are different than us, who are wrong. And because we start feeling morally superior, we start becoming judgmental. And when that happens, it's just easy to get offended. It's just easy to be angry, which is unfortunately far too true of too many people. And that's just the exact opposite of who Jesus was, what he was, and what he called us to. I want you to think about this for a moment. Think about this. Jesus was the most righteous person, the most right. Remember, no sin. The most right person who ever lived, and yet he was the least judgmental. Think about that. He was perfect, and yet he was the least judgmental. And we talked about it last week or a couple weeks ago. The story of the woman who was caught in adultery. Remember the story if you were with us. You had these Pharisees. They were technically right. They brought before Jesus this woman who was technically wrong. She was completely wrong. They were right. She was wrong. So Jesus, remember if you were here with us, if you weren't, man, you want to check it out. He says to these Pharisees, he says, all right, if you've never sinned, you have the right to judge her and cast that first stone. But if you haven't sinned, you have no right to judge her. Remember? Drop the stone. Well, they all split because they knew they had sinned. It's now Jesus and this woman who is wrong, who had been caught in sin, and Jesus, who has never sinned, who has the right to judge, to cast the stone. He says, I don't condemn you. And then he gives the truth. He included truth. He says, go and sin no more. It was truth shared in the context of actively loving her. Truth in the context of real, active, genuine love. How do you think she felt? Man, you better believe she felt valued. She felt seen. She felt loved in spite of the fact that her heart was messed up, but she saw that his heart was different. Jesus is concerned about right and wrong. Of course he is, but he's also concerned about pride and humility. Whenever you and I start from a place of I'm right, we start to feel morally superior. That's how we end up becoming judgmental. That's how we end up being so easily angered and offended. But if you and I, man, if we would start with humility, if we start from the place of I've been forgiven, that we begin to feel and experience the forgiveness of God, you know what then pours out of us? This heart and the spirit of gratitude. And when we begin to see others through the lens of the amazing grace and goodness that God's shown us, and how grateful we are that he saved us, man, gratitude can begin to pour out of us towards others. And when gratitude pours out to others from us, man, they're going to feel far more welcomed by us, even if they're totally different than us. I talk about this a lot, and I talk about it from many different angles through the years, and in different sermon series and different parts of messages. And I do it because I see and hear people so often they just haven't figured this out. Because far too often we spend way too much time focused on being right. And that's just why so many believers are so ineffective for the kingdom. And frankly, they're hurting their witness for the kingdom. But man, there is another way. It's the Jesus way. It's the as I have loved you way. It's the way of the towel. It's the humility. Put the towel on your arm. Get down on your knees and submit humbly to others and serve them. That's when we are far more loving. We can still share the truth, and we still need to share the truth, of course. But if you want to be effective for the kingdom and make disciples, do it the Jesus way. Share truth and love the Jesus way in the context of being a servant. By the way, some of you are amazing at this. I've talked to many of you and heard your stories. Some of you can get on an airplane, talk to a random person who's sitting next to you, find out that they are so wrapped up in sin and so far from God. And some of you, because I've talked to you, man, I admire you because you have the ability to love them sitting on that airplane and yet pour out the truth of God in the context of a conversation and relationship. But some of us, not so much. We rarely help people by judging them, but we just might help them by loving them. To Jesus, it wasn't just about right and wrong. It was also about pride and humility. Because, church, the reality is, prideful people just don't love well. But humble people who truly understand they've been forgiven, they love those who are hurting. They love those who are broken. They love those who need the grace of Jesus, just like you and I did. So as we wrap it up here, I told you that I'd push you. I'd like to push you one more time. You can be right. You can be right about a lot of things, maybe even most things, maybe everything. But far too many people are not right in their approach, in their strategy to reach people who are far from God. So the reality is, as much as you think you're right, you may not be as right as you think you are. So what if you'd be willing to humble yourself? Jesus didn't say, they will know you by your righteousness. They will know you by how right you are. That's not what he said. What did he say? They will know you by your what? By your love. You can share the truth. You should share the truth. But man, do it in the context of, as I have loved you, Jesus way, the humble way, the servant way. And so I want to just ask it this way. Why in the world would you ever want to abandon the Jesus way, the as I have loved you way, being a servant and surrendering and humbling yourself before? Why would you surrender Jesus' strategy to make disciples for the Pharisee strategy? Why would we want to do that? Why would we want to say, I'm going to take the strategy and the method and the way I live my life and the way I think about life through the lens of I'm right, I have truth? Why that's the Pharisee approach. How about we take the Jesus approach? As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Somebody who puts on a towel on their arm, gets down on his knees and serves others while still saying, go and sin no more. That's the route I want to take. They will know us by our love. Is that true of you? Because it's just possible that for some of us, it's not true.